We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood.
This is the 1998 edition of MMA legend Randy Couture, and this is the 1998 edition of me. Despite the very obvious physical discrepancies, Randy looks like a lab experiment to grow a wrestler by crossbreeding a bald eagle with a ballpark hot dog, and I look like I could give you a first-hand account of the potato famine. Randy and I are practically the same person. He's a former UFC heavyweight champion, and I won a participation trophy in a karate competition when I was 6. He's been in 4 Expendables movies, and I've seen some of an Expendables movie. We both have an intense and enduring passion for battle wounds and bruises. That's great. And in 1998, we both quit our jobs in stunning fashion. Overflowing with that unmistakable brand of misplaced confidence that practically oozes from teenage pores, I, convinced I was about to embark on a new career as the world's least talented yet somehow most successful rock star, walked out of my office job, never to return. When asked where the hell I thought I was going, I summoned all the wit and verve my malnourished brain could muster, and like a teenage Oscar Wilde, replied, I'm going to go hang out and screw hot chicks, because I was a terminal moron, and I think I heard that in an episode of South Park or something. Randy left his job in similar circumstances, though as UFC heavyweight champion, he was likely having sex with non-imaginary hot chicks. When we last saw Couture, he had just won the UFC title from Maurice Smith at UFC Japan, in one of the worst fights outside of a Neil Breen movie.
Very nice fighting technique. Very nice work.
The lineal title had now been passed from Coleman to Smith to Couture. Randy should have been on top of the world. He was the premier MMA organization's champion in its marquee division, but being the UFC heavyweight champion in 1998 was a bit like being the world's best Battleborn player in 2024. A feat that might sound impressive until you realise only 2 people on Earth have actively played that game in the last month. By 98, the UFC had fallen dick first on hard times. The pay-per-view ban had made the sport practically invisible to average fans like violent George Costanza.
It's real, and they're going at it, and it's men beating the crap out of men, and it's good. And that's what we like.
Profits were lower than the barrier for entry to act in a Roadhouse reboot.
Sandwiches.
And they staged only 3 events for the entire year, the lowest number since 1994. By the time of Randy's first title reign, the UFC were in the worst dire straits since the greatest hits of Dire Straits. After winning the title from Smith, Randy had negotiated a 3-fight contract with the UFC. One of the stipulations being that his pay would increase with each fight. In the first fight on his contract, Randy was set to defend the title against former Pancrase champion and man responsible for more liver damage than Jack Daniels, Bas Rutten. But that fight would never take place, as UFC heavyweight champions and unresolvable contract disputes are the most iconic tag team since the Rockers. And I don't know about you guys, but nothing is more quintessentially rock and roll to me than day-glow spandex, tassels, and all-you-can-eat mullets. despite Randy's new goatee, the UFC reneged on their contract, and when it came time to fight Bas Rutten, they could only offer Randy a pair of nearly new Asics and a photo of Mark Coleman autographed by Dan Severn. Couture was still a relative newcomer to no-holds-barred fighting at this point. He had won the heavyweight title on only his 4th professional fight, but he still knew his worth and wasn't willing to fight for anything less than what they had agreed upon. In actuality, Randy wasn't even 100% sold on this whole no-holds-barred thing anyway, and was mostly fighting just to fund his wrestling career. No, not that kind of wrestling, the manly kind of wrestling, in scenes that would repeat themselves once the lineal title passes to Francis Ngannou over 2 decades later. Negotiations between the UFC and their heavyweight champion collapsed. Randy sashayed out of the organisation after telling them he was going to go hang out and screw hot chicks instead. He just like me, for real. Ultimately, Randy quit the UFC, and while he could no longer lay claim to the official title of UFC heavyweight champion, that would go to Bas Rutten after he beat Kevin Randleman for the vacant title, Randy still retained the lineal champion status. As most fisting experts agree, the title can only change hands with an exchange of fists. In the 1990s, the UFC was the biggest name in no-holds-barred fighting, but while the US-based UFC was the face of this fledgling sport, Japan was the beating heart of free association fisting. Pancrase, Shooto, Vale Tudo Japan, Pride, Street Fighter II, the Japanese were birthing more violence than Kratos' mother. When Randy left the UFC in '98, there were next to no opportunities for no-holds-barred fighting in the US that weren't the UFC. Battlecade had battled its last Cade, and King of the Cage was still a twinkle in Bas Rutten's liver, one that wouldn't come to fruition until 1999. And again, I just have to give a quick shout out to whoever is responsible for coming up with the King of the Cage subtitles. It's 23 years later and they're still coming up with new names for every event, like Sin Revival, Energetic Pursuit, Slam Down, and Glory Hole. Anonymous King of the Cage subtitle creator, you are the real hero of this story. With less job prospects than Connor's acting coach,
I got a message for you. From your father.
Randy turned his eyes eastward, to the new mecca of professional fisting, Japan. But let's briefly rewind to 1995, 2 years prior to Randy's debut on the opposite side of the world, where a Japanese-American fighter named Enson Inoue is about to make his professional no-holds-barred fighting debut. Enson is probably the most underappreciated fighting character since Bruce Irving from Tekken. Much like NHB luminaries Tank Abbott, Scott Ferozzo, and 90% of other fighters in the 1990s, Enson began his fighting career on the streets. It's unknown as to whether he was ring deadly and or street lethal, but by the age of 16, Enson was involved in what sounded like some kind of Streets of Rage reenactment society on a semi-regular basis. As fate would have it, when Enson enrolled at the University of Hawaii, Helson Gracie had just begun teaching jiu-jitsu classes at the university's gym. After Enson was shown the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in action videotape, he signed up for classes, and his fighting career moved from the streets to the ground. He spent a year training with Helson, earning a blue belt in the process, but fighting was secondary to his biggest passion, racquetball. Enson's brother Egan was a world champion racquetball player.
Hi, I'm Egan Inoue. Racquetball is a very fun and exciting game, and also very addicting.
And Enson was good enough at the sport that he moved to Japan to teach and compete in racquetball tournaments. But racquetball would prove to be a passing phase for Enson. In 1994, Rickson Gracie arrived in Japan to take part in the inaugural Vale Tudo Japan event, and in the process gave us the greatest poster since Ken M. Japan kills it every time with their event posters. Sakuraba being choked by his wife, Baki thirst traps, breastfeeding? Okay, this one's from my fanfiction folder. Sakuraba being slapped around by his wife? Okay, I'm kind of sensing a theme here. But compare this to the creatively destitute modern day UFC posters to see just how far the humble fight poster has fallen as an art form. Given his history with the Gracies, Enson considered himself both a friend of Helson and Hickson, a friendship that would dramatically run aground in time. But in 1994, Enson still considered himself both a friend of the Gracies and a representative of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. He attended Vale Tudo, Japan to support his former instructors, and in the process, changed the course of his life unalterably. Enson was captivated by this undiscovered country of no holds barred. Unable to shake the idea of competing himself, he called every organisation he could think of to ask could he try out for them. The only organisation to take him up on the offer was Shooto. Becoming a fighter in the UFC today involves more steps than a well-attended AA meeting. You'll need a competent gym, most of which will set you back a few $100 per month. You'll need to commit yourself to a Tito Ortiz level of overtraining.
5 days a week, I'll train 3 days a week. One of those days I will train 2 days of the week, so 6 days a week I'll be training.
Only then can you consider yourself Bangkok ready for a few amateur fights. Win those and you can turn pro. Then it's just a matter of getting a win streak large enough to be noticeable by Dana White's Disposable Labor Force series. Win a fight on that show and you'll be in line to be considered for a contract. And even at that, you'll probably still need to be a fucking Nelk boy just to get Dana White to stop ogling Laura Sanko long enough to notice you. In 1995, Enson Inoue rocked up to Shooto's gym with nothing but a handful of street brawls and a bit of pajama cuddling under his belt and tried out for a job. Enson could have been any brand of delusional street fighter who doesn't need to train because when it's time to go he just sees red and bodies start dropping. But Shooto gave him a chance and let him spar the #1 fighter in the gym, Yuki Nakai. Nakai himself would go on to become the kind of guy even the toughest fighters tell their kids bedtime stories about, speaking in reverential tones about the time he fought Hickson Gracie despite being blinded in one eye earlier that same night by the Savat scumbag Gerard Gordeau. Nakai's is a brand of toughness that would give modern-day athletic commissions night terrors, practically goading them, "Stop me before I fight again." His heart and toughness is unquestionable. What is questionable is his grappling. That afternoon in 1995 when Enson walked through the doors was not a good day for Nakai. Having next to no knowledge of grappling or submissions, Enson took him down and submitted him with ease, time after time. And that's how a man with comparatively little training and not a single sanctioned fight, amateur or pro, found himself fighting for one of Japan's biggest organizations. Enson originally only ever planned to have one fight, simply to test himself. But after his first win, he was hooked and wound up having 8 fights in Shooto, with 6 wins and 2 losses. In 1997, he was called up to the UFC for his first and only fight in the organization. Enson fought at UFC 13, The Ultimate Force. And as a brief aside, Ultimate Force also happens to be the name of Mirko Cro Cop's one and only direct-to-Pirate Bay acting debut, which, it saddens me to say, had an IMDb score of 3.0 when I first brought it to people's attention in my Pride video, and as of today, it's currently sitting at a 2.7. How have we let this happen? UFC 13 was another tournament card, featuring lightweight and heavyweight brackets. In a bizarre coincidence, this card was both Randy and Enson's UFC debut, Enson competing in the lightweight category and Randy competing at heavyweight.
Enson Inoue and Royce Alger square off in semifinal number 2.
But without a doubt, Alger is the one everyone's looking at. Tremendous wrestling background.
Enson fought Royce Alger, aka the Fighting Farmer. Alger had a storied freestyle wrestling career, but was making his no-holds-barred debut. His tale of the tape listed him as having limited strikes and few submissions, which for a fighter Seems a bit like going into a game of Halo in 2007 without a $2 microphone.
Your mom was all about me last night.
Fuck you,
yeah, you're right.
I hate you.
Fucking little kid.
Like, how did you even get this job? Enson won via armbar in round 1, but had to withdraw from the final due to injury, and in the process, inadvertently helped create the entire Tito Ortiz Lions Den Gym rivalry, as Tito replaced Enson and fought Lions Den Gym fighter Guy Mezger in the finals. By October of 1998, 1 year after UFC 13, both Enson and Randy were now ex-UFC fighters. For the first time in his fighting career, Randy found himself looking for work, and as chance would have it, he and Enson would meet in a match billed as UFC Heavyweight Champion versus Shooto Heavyweight Champion at Vale Tudo Japan 98. Vale Tudo Japan 98 is a veritable who's who of, oh shit, that guy? It's like watching a fighting event made by Stars Originals. A one-night parade of people who you kinda know, but you're not entirely sure why. There's Cal Uno, who you might remember for being flattened by BJ Penn in 10 seconds. There's Vladimir Matyushenko, a former heavyweight champion for the IFL, a fighting league that was probably only watched by both of Battleborn's players. There's Jean-Jacques Machado, the man who trained Keanu Reeves for the John Wick movies and one of the most respected jiu-jitsu practitioners alive, making his MMA debut and retirement in the same night.
In the near future, you are going to fight in the Baritudo.
Yes, I'm gonna keep training, looking for the next one. Then I'll be back for sure. Looking for the next one, definitely.
Here's Andre Pederneiras, more famous as Jose Aldo's coach than for his own fighting career. We've also got Brandon Lee Hinkle, a man whose sole win in the UFC is over Sean Gannon, who in turn was most notable for beating Kimbo Slice in an unsanctioned fight. Hinkle actually scored the knockout of the night, with the most vicious soccer kick I've seen outside of riot footage. Enson vs Randy was the biggest fight of the night by a considerable margin. The Shooto heavyweight champ versus the UFC heavyweight champ. Enson had huge support from the Japanese media at the time, something that he himself was conflicted about. As a Japanese American, he was viewed by many Japanese natives as a gaijin or outsider, yet once he started winning fights, he was hailed as the greatest Japanese export since hentai. Despite this support, Enson was considered to be about as likely to win as Titanic was to get a sequel. The only person who thought he had a chance was Enson himself. To really compound that we were ass deep in the 90s at this point, Randy's walkout music was Everything Zen by the Temu version of Nirvana, Bush.
UFC Japan 大会に初来日 UFC 世界ヘビー級選手権でチャンピオンのモーリス・スミスを
The fight was not 25 minutes of Enson being used as a body pillow like most people assumed it would be. After an opening minute in which he channeled the spirit of Antonio Inoki, Enson got Randy in his guard, and taking advantage of Couture's complete lack of submission defense, slapped on an armbar and shockered the world. After only 1 minute and 39 seconds of fighting, Enson Inoue had caused one of the biggest upsets in the sport at the time, and was now the fourth man to capture the lineal heavyweight title. Post-win, Enson had an in-ring celebration with his dog, and then gave a speech that belongs in the Pettiness Hall of Fame. The loose translation amounting to him saying, "To everyone who doubted me, fuck you," before doing a very literal mic drop. After losing the lineal title, Randy would go on to have one of the most storied careers in MMA history. But it's a career the UFC would also like to pretend never happened. Dana has attempted to scrub Randy's name from history as if he were scrubbing hooker blood from a hotel bedsheet. Randy fought for another year in Japan, under the banner of rings.
From America, Randy Couture!
He wouldn't return to the UFC until the new millennium, Y2K had been and gone before Randy returned home in November of 2000. Once back in the UFC, he promptly reclaimed the actual heavyweight title by beating Kevin Randleman. Couture's career is like a CVS receipt of accomplishments and is something not so easily erased from history, no matter how hard steroid Gargamel might try. He won titles at both heavyweight and light heavyweight, won the heavyweight title a record-setting 3 times, coached The Ultimate Fighter, that's great, was chosen as MMA's representative versus boxing when James Toney tried to clown on MMA.
James Toney picked a fight. James Toney chased me around the country, calling me names, calling me a sissy and a pussy, and that we're afraid of boxing.
I ain't going nowhere, I'm knocking your ass out.
Had a famous trilogy with Chuck Liddell, and a famous quadrilogy of Expendables movies. But it wasn't all good news, as he was also in a quadrilogy of Expendables movies. Randy's career highlights could fill the runtime of this video if I let them, but despite the innumerable highs, it was also notable for being the rockiest relationship Dana White ever had.
Francis doesn't want to fight these 2 guys now.
Second rockiest relationship Dana White ever had. Third rockiest relationship Dana White ever.
Whoever gave you that quote is a pussy and a and a liar. You dumb bitch. You, Loretta Hunt.
Fourth
I don't give a shit what Ariel Helwani thinks.
Fair enough.
Who the fuck is Ariel Helwani? To get them now!
Randy left the UFC 3 times in total, citing contract disputes, poor pay, and in later years, frustration at the UFC's inability to come to terms with Fedor Emelianenko. The Fedor fight was Randy's white whale, a fight that he would pursue to the very ends of the earth itself, and for MMA fans in 2007, there were few bigger fights than the prospect of Randy v Fedor. Dana had claimed that the fight couldn't happen because Fedor was under contract with Affliction, an MMA/t-shirt company whose designs looked like somebody asked Fred Durst to draw a tap-out logo from memory. But Dana only told a half-truth. Fedor was under contract with Affliction, but that contract had a clause that allowed him the freedom to fight in any organization he pleased, and the exclusivity only applied to the US, so realistically, if the right money was on offer, the UFC could have quite easily held Randy v Fedor anywhere outside of the US without tripping over contractual issues with Affliction. Dana was unwilling to co-promote with Affliction, but instead, he was going to offer Fedor a fair deal, which likely involved a brand new pair of Asics and a photo of Dan Severn signed by Dana White.
He has become my obsession, man. You know? He has become my obsession. I want it worse than the fans want it now, believe me.
So desperate was Randy to fight Fedor that in 2007 he resigned from the UFC and attempted to wait for his contract to expire. Randy was still the UFC heavyweight champion at this point, and the UFC essentially refused to acknowledge his retirement and still claimed him as their heavyweight champion. Despite filming a stare down with Fedor that was more sexually charged than a man with a Tesla fetish, a deal would never be worked out. Until this day, the only place you'll ever see that fight is in EA MMA.
Are you kidding me? That's a TKO victory, and the fight had seemingly just begun. He smashed him into the ground.
It took 11 months of lawyering before Randy eventually returned to the UFC. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of a more definitive way in all of Christendom to send an Everest-sized fuck you to your prodigal son than to welcome them home with a fight against a prime Brock Lesnar.
I'm a white boy, and I'm jacked. Deal with it.
Randy fought Brock at UFC 91 in November 2008. He was 45 at this point, versus a 31-year-old Lesnar. Brock outweighed him by 45 pounds, and Dana had probably been poking him with a stick to rile him up beforehand. To compound the fact that Dana wanted Randy deader than Diddy's career, the referee was Mario fucking Yamasaki.
Blood for the blood god! Blood for the blood god! Blood for the blood god!
If Dana wanted him dead, it would have been more humane to just plant a bomb in his car. similar to how Randy's manager's brand new BMW just happened to explode while driving one day, which is a totally normal thing that cars do sometimes, and I am not inferring anything with this statement in any way. His car probably just had the explode button turned on or something like that. To give credit to Randy, it took balls so large they have their own gravitational pull to accept that fight, and he was doing great up until the second round, when Brock attempted to phase walk his head through the canvas with those colossal meat mallets he calls fists.
Deal with it.
Randy lost the heavyweight title to Brock and would never touch UFC gold again. In 2010, he took part in the first ever Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer fight versus none other than Mark Coleman, and in 2011 he retired for good after losing to Lyoto Machida. As recently as UFC 300, the UFC has done their utmost to deny Randy and his contributions to MMA. See their entire history of the UFC in 3 minutes video that somehow manages to tell the entire organization's history without once mentioning 3-time heavyweight and multi-division champion Couture. But greatness will always outlive pettiness. Couture retired with a career record of 19 wins, 11 losses. But those numbers alone cannot paint a picture of a man who dictated the terms of his own career, who fought everyone from greats to giants and never settled for anything less than he was worth. That's great. As for Enson, after claiming the lineal title from Randy, his stock rose like embers against an ink-black sky. With his newfound fame, the next step in his career was all but decided for him. It's Pride. We're doing Pride again. I'm assuming that 99.9% of you watching this know what Pride was, but on the very slim chance that this is your introduction, I happen to have a short explainer video on the topic. But for now, all you really need to know is that Pride was an organisation where the best always fought the best, and sometimes for laughs they fought the worst. Steroids were legal if not outright encouraged, and spectacle was prized above all. It was about as close as we'll ever get to seeing something like Tekken in real life, and it was just fucking beautiful. With Enson's ascension into the ranks of Pride, the lineal title now passed into its third organisation, from the UFC to Vale Tudo Japan, and now Pride. Inoue's first fight as lineal title holder would take place at Pride 5, April 29th in 1999. This was still the early days for Pride. It had only been in existence for around 2 years and lacked many of the big names they would ultimately become synonymous with, such as Vanderlei Silva, Shogun Rua, Cro Cop, and Fedor. A lack of star power might explain why Enson's first fight as lineal title holder was against this man, Soichi Nishida. In an era that was notable for having fighters with more imaginary records than John Lennon, such as advanced level ASACS practitioner Julian Sanchez, who claimed to be a street fighter but was probably just this guy, Nishida still manages to be one of the more baffling additions to MMA lore, and easily the least qualified person to ever have their name even remotely attached to the lineal title. Nishida had zero verifiable fight experience going into Pride 5. It's unknown if the man had even seen Hulk Hogan's certified 3 out of 10 no holds barred before embarking upon a career in no holds barred.
Yo, homeboy! Welcome to the hood, brother!
Commentators Bas Rutten and Stephen Quadros seem to be holding back a combination of confusion and hysterics while attempting to make sense of what they're seeing in Nishida's corner.
Oh, no. This is something else. Yeah, it's kind of like East LA meets ninjutsu.
Nishida was a living layup, an organic open goal, and Enson uninstalled his consciousness within 30 seconds of round 1 for his first successful defense of the lineal title.
You win.
I never had such an easy victory.
Nishida, to both his credit and detriment, kept on fighting despite never improving his skill set above bum-ass bum. His presence in MMA is a baffling one that some have suggested is thanks to possible Yakuza links, allegedly, and having enough power in that world to get himself put on these cards, as nothing else about this man's fighting career makes anything close to sense.
Very nice fighting technique. Very nice work.
It's January 30th, 2000. The new decade was but a rudely awakened child. Pre-millennium tension and Y2K anxiety are giving way to a new sense of optimism for the coming decade. That optimism would be short-lived, but on that January morning, we still lived in a world of seemingly endless possibilities. The Matrix was the greatest sci-fi action movie since Predator, and not a rallying cry for TikTok-dwelling shit-grifters. The internet felt like a village, a community, and not a brutalist office block, a fiefdom for a server full of megacorporations. It still felt like a place where it was accepted, if not outright encouraged, that you could make a website dedicated to nothing but animated ferret gifs, or making your pet mouse fly some kind of homemade drone. And as this page is over 20 years old now, rest in peace, Orville the Mouse.
I will remember you.
Amidst all that optimism, Pride were about to start the new decade with a tournament, the likes of which had never been attempted before. The lineal title had made its way to the now mythical Pride Openweight Grand Prix 2000.
I'm Guy Mesger. I'm here at the Pride. It's real, exciting, and it's extreme.
Tournaments had been a hallmark of MMA since the earliest days of the UFC, but the vast majority had been one-night single-elimination tournaments. These tournaments were almost always disastrous, with fighters often being too beat up to continue after their opening match, but Pride had the solution. A solution that would make for the greatest event yet seen in MMA. Instead of a one-night single-elimination tournament, they would stage a two-night single-elimination tournament. Wait, that was it? Oh, for fuck. The Pride Openweight Grand Prix would hold a 16-man opening round on that January evening, whittled down to an 8-man final tournament to be held in May. I've mentioned that Pride valued spectacle above all else, but even sitting here in 2024, re-watching the opening ceremony, it's both impressive and depressing that I don't think I've seen an MMA event in recent years with production values this high. Everything about this opening ceremony screams excitement. There's explosions, there's a gigantic stage where each fighter gets an individual introduction like this is the attract screen of an arcade game, and there's a live band playing a rocked out version of the Pride theme. A theme that already went harder than a diamond sledgehammer even before rearranging it with screaming guitars. A lot of fans nowadays will tell you that this kind of spectacle doesn't belong in MMA and should be saved for pro wrestling. But just listen to Ken Shamrock talking about how this kind of spectacle makes a fighter feel respected and valued by both the fans and company.
Yeah, well, this makes you feel like all the hard work that you put through, to get to this point, and you come out and these people appreciate it. You get this kind of a respect and the kind of money that they put into this production. You feel like you belong and you're important here.
And then try and tell me that a fighter walking out to an empty Apex arena feels anything close to that. And just as an aside here, I can't verify the legitimacy of this quote as it's from a YouTube comment provided to me by a member of my Discord server, but I really want this to be true, so I'm going to tell it to you anyway. The Pride theme composer, Yasuharu Takanashi, said that this piece is his most prized composition. He wrote it on the day his father passed away, this music being his way of reckoning with a grief that for many is insurmountable. Discussing this piece, he said, "I wanted to defeat the weakness inside of me. I never want to lose ever again." Great, so now this music makes me cry and gives me an erection. The 2000 Grand Prix was a historic event that could realistically fill an entire video by itself. It was the tournament that featured the legendary 90-minute match between Sakuraba and Hoyce, and marked Coleman's career redemption arc. There was even a peek into an alternate timeline where Vanderlei Silva came from a place called Brazil and was a submission specialist, as the lone submission win in his entire career happened at the 2000 GP. And a Vanderlei fight that ends in submission is like a gender reveal party where the gender is revealed to be Stygian horror. No one's expecting it, and even less people want it. But the Openweight Grand Prix isn't the focus of this story. The travails of the lineal title is the path we're following, and Enson's next fight as lineal champion came in the second to last match of the evening, versus Mark Kerr. Mark Kerr, the smashing machine, the man whose back muscles you could land a plane on, the man responsible for the invention of Google just so people could look up where to buy steroids, probably. The man who left destruction in his wake like a one-man Mongol horde. Owner of the only chin-to-eye submission in the UFC. This win was via DQ after his opponent attempted to crawl out of the ring, possibly because Kerr had eaten both of his legs. Knees, headbutts, generalized smashing. Kerr was routinely delivering torture like a medieval Amazon. What carnage was in store for Enson when Kerr cried havoc and let slip the lats of war? Had Enson's kin been informed he was about to be crushed into dust by a steroid-engorged effigy of muscular annihilation? It was just 15 minutes of this. Enson vs. Kerr is a fight you should never bother watching. I sat through all 15 minutes to save you the time. Kerr delivered torture alright, but the vast majority of it was saved for the audience, as Kerr laid atop of Inoue from the opening to closing bell. Kerr does some ground and pound which results in a bloody nose for Inoue, but that's genuinely the most exciting part of a fight that is otherwise more forgettable than a Crazy Town concept album about narcolepsy. When the bell finally rang after 15 excruciating minutes, Kerr was proclaimed the winner, and the fourth recipient of the lineal heavyweight title. When I introduced Enson in this video, I described him as underappreciated, but to look at his record, both pre- and post-lineal title, you're probably thinking, no, he's exactly as appreciated as he should be. The biggest win of his career was Randy Couture, and while Randy went on to undeniable greatness, Enson's post-lineal career was, on paper, nothing to write home about, unless you have an incandescent desire to inform your parents, "Hi Mom and Dad, I've only won 2 fights in my last 6. But there's a little more to Enson than his record suggests. It's pretty common for fighters to invoke the image of the samurai as the final boss of noble badassery, almost like the absolute fucking drip of medieval knights wasn't good enough for them. The motherfuckers act like they forgot about Zweihanders.
You're just an average bloke.
Good use of English terminology.
I'm a fucking samurai. I'm gonna come in there silent, undetected.
But when someone like Luke Rockhold talks about being a modern-day samurai whilst shilling Ralph Lauren suits at the same time, it can come off as about as believable as when Chris Weidman tells you he's only one more win away from a title shot. Enson lives by a code he calls Yamato Damashi, which roughly translates to the spirit of the samurai. It's on his t-shirts, it's on his book, and you can't look into Enson Inoue for longer than 5 minutes without coming across at least 10 mentions of Yamato Damashi. For Enson, fighting was never about winning or losing, but purely a test of whether or not he was willing to die in service to Yamato Damashi. And I get it, I can practically hear your eyeballs rolling at that last sentence, but bear with me just a second. Enson's comeback fight after losing the title to Kerr was against Igor Vovchanchin. Vovchanchin is regarded by many as being a prototype Fedor, a true all-rounder who was as comfortable striking as he was grappling. Vovchanchin has a record of 56 wins, 10 losses, and by the time he fought Enson, he was on his 46th pro fight, versus Enson's 14th. Vovchanchyn was a killer who held wins over Mark Kerr, Kazushi Sakuraba, and Gary Goodridge, though funnily enough he also holds a loss to Trampoline Teligman. Enson fought Vovchanchyn at Pride 10, August 27, 2000. And just a quick aside here, the following segment does not look like how it is supposed to look. It's a serious segment, and as such I wanted it to be nothing but straight fight footage with little to no editing. But with UFC and YouTube copyright, that's kinda like a woman saying, I want to use a dating app and not get unsolicited pictures of penises. Despite every attempt I made to get this to pass copyright, the only way I could find to get this thing up on YouTube was to make this look like this. It's not ideal, but I hope you're still able to enjoy the section, and as always, the uncensored version is available on Patreon, which also contains a half-naked photograph of me and my best friend from 1998, instead of this more YouTube acceptable photo of me suffering from the worst hangover I've ever had in my life. So if any of that sounds appealing to you, or if you just want to help support these videos, you can do so there. Thank you. I've watched a lot of MMA. I've seen Vanderlei knee Rampage Jackson so hard he fell out of the ring. I've seen Tony Ferguson struggle in vain against unconsciousness after taking one of the worst beatings in history. And I've seen Izzy mouth the words, I am ready to die here, when he fought Gastelum. Yet for all their brutality, none of these fights made me fear for a fighter's life quite like Inoue versus Vovchanchyn. The fight starts with a brawl so frenzied, it's like watching Fry vs Takayama on 1.7x speed. Inoue claimed that in order to test his Yamato Damashi, he went against all his corner's advice, which was to grapple with Vovchanchyn, and instead decided to swing so wildly that at one point both men are back to back after missing flailing right hands. But after the frantic opening seconds, Vovchanchyn throws Inoue to the mat, and this fight becomes a deeply uncomfortable watch. For almost 15 minutes, Vovchanchyn beats Inoue, quite literally, to within an inch of his life. This fight is an atrocity exhibition for ground and pound, a showcase of unbridled sadism. Every strike Vovchanchyn throws hits with a sickening thud that can be heard over both the audience and commentators.
Dropping bombs now. Right back fist. Enson's in trouble here.
Every time his fists make contact, they are a missive of sound and fury, and even watching this 24 years later, the brutality of this fight has not diminished. Vovchanchyn stayed on the ground with Enson for the entirety of the fight, and delivered hammer blow after hammer blow for the remainder of the 15-minute round. Enson claims that he lost consciousness 2 or 3 times during this beating. He described Igor's punches as feeling like they weren't doing damage on the surface, but every single one was stabbing directly into his brain. 7 minutes into the fight, Pride officials were pleading with Inoue's corner to throw in the towel, but for better or worse, Enson had instructed them under no circumstances was the fight to be waved off. The fight continued, and for another 8 minutes, Vovchanchyn dropped punch after punch after punch. When the round bell rings, there's a palpable sense of relief, even as a viewer, that this barbarity might finally be over. But as Enson attempts to make his way back to his corner, his feet refuse to comply. Unable to stand, he is dragged by the armpits back to his corner. Beaten beyond recognition, he was unable to even sit on the stool, and is instead reduced to a bloodied heap, slumped against the ring post, while his visibly panicked team buzz around him. Enson now has 2 minutes in which to recover before the second round. Through a haze of concussion and the panicked chatter of his cornermen, he hears talk of the fight being waved off. And that's when a sound even more chilling than Vovchanchyn's hellacious ground and pound is heard. From the canvas, Enson begins screaming, "No, no, I'm okay. I can still fight."
Hope they stop it. No. He shouldn't go back out there because standing up, he's not got no shot. His head is still spinning. He's not going to make it. Vovchanchyn will drop. That fight is over. Fight is over. It looked like he wanted to continue. Looked like he wanted to continue.
Enson suffered a ruptured eardrum, broken jaw, broken finger, and would spend over a week in hospital. Yet despite all this, despite being one punch away from death, his biggest fear was that the fight would be stopped. His body had been battered beyond all use, but his spirit was still determined to fight. Even reading all of this in Enson's autobiography, knowing full well he's alive today, I was genuinely afraid that this chapter might end somehow with his death. When Enson Inoue talks about having a samurai spirit, he might just be the only man in the world I believe.
勝ちたかったけど、練習とかいいゴールもしようさで足りなかった。もっと練習して上手くなるように頑張ります。皆さん、今日もうこれから申し訳ございません。
Enson would semi-retire after the Vovchanchin fight. He only had 5 more fights over the next 10 years, with 2 wins and 3 losses, one of which was a rematch with Soichi Nishida, who submitted Enson in the first minute of round 1. Wait, sorry, I got that all backwards. No, Nishida lost that one too. Enson retired for good in 2010. Inoue is one of those fighters whose personality and story outshines what is on paper a pretty modest record of 12-8, with only 1 win over a championship caliber fighter. He's definitely not a Yakuza, but he just hangs out with Yakuza, trains Yakuza, was almost run over by a Yakuza, holds underground fight clubs for the Yakuza, and poses for gun-waving photographs with Yakuza in a picture with the caption, "Don't mess with the Yakuza, #Yakuza," but he is definitely not a Yakuza. In 2011, one of the worst natural disasters in living memory struck Japan, in the form of the Tohoku earthquake and subsequent tsunami. Enson, without hesitation, made his way to the worst affected regions to provide aid.
It was hard at first, but as I always frequently visited them and brought up stuff without them asking and just laying it on a table and having them line up and pick out what they need, they started talking to me. To a point where when I left, they would come up and a lady would come and say, "Can you get size 6 shoes? I need shoes." And they don't have shoes, they don't have anything, you know? So then that's when the movement all happened, and I started experiencing that joy of giving to people that I don't know.
In the years since then, he still makes regular trips to help the affected residents. In 2014, he released his autobiography, which clarified once and for all that this man right here, Enson Inoue, is definitely 100% not a Yakuza. The lineal title passes through many disparate owners on its journey, from instantly recognizable icons to fighters you may not even know, and while we're far, far from finished, it's safe to say that among the title's many custodians, Enson is, and will forever remain, unique. Mark Kerr was now the 5th lineal champion, but he wouldn't have long to bask in all of its imaginary glory. This being the early 2000s, fighter safety was as distant a concern as the heat death of the universe. So only 4 months after beating Enson, Kerr would be called upon to defend this completely imaginary title that he probably didn't even know he owned at the Pride Grand Prix finals, where he would face this man, Kazuyuki Fujita. Nicknames can tell you a lot about a fighter. Vanderlei is known as the Axe Murderer because he didn't have opponents, he had victims. Mark Kerr was known as the Smashing Machine because he seemed like the human equivalent of this fucking thing from Robot Wars. Valentina is known as the Bullet because I'd like to be deeply penetrated. Kazuyuki Fujita's nickname is Old Ironhead, and it's quite possibly the most apt nickname in the annals of MMA. Justin Gaethje was once called the Homer Simpson of MMA, given his freakish ability to absorb damage in the same way Homer did when he became a boxer in the episode The Homer They Fall. But Fujita is a man whose ability to ingurgitate physical violence with the casual nonchalance of a man making polite elevator conversation would eclipse both Gaethje and Homer. In 2010, a treatise on Fujita's ability to absorb more impacts than the surface of the moon and still be able to remember his own birthday was written by the man who invented being funny on the internet, Sean Baby. Till this day, no discussion of Fujita can be had without someone first asking, "Hey, have you read that thing about his skull?" So here to try and convey just how dense the material comprising Fujita's head is Sean Baby.
Kazuyuki Ironhead Fujita made a fighting career out of having a thick skull. This is that skull's story. Like many mixed martial artists, Fujita started as a wrestler. Unlike many mixed martial artists, he never learned a second skill. It would take him 60 minutes to describe to you what he thinks a kick is, and he attempts submission holds the same way he tries on hats, confusedly pulling in random directions with no results. That's because his skull is measurably thicker than a normal skull. If you were to take an x-ray of it, you'd fire your medical equipment for coming into work drunk. He was created by filling a cement truck with coconut sperm, and no one was more surprised than that cement truck. Since he was diagnosed with this head, he has been searching for the man who would one day destroy it.
Fujita was a relative unknown going into the Grand Prix finals. He was a wrestler, both the manly kind and the sports entertainment kind.
Yo, homeboy!
Nope, not showing that one again. He had made his MMA debut in Pride and went 3-0, but his wins were mostly over a bunch of Nishidas. His first real test would be when he fought Kerr, and his ability to absorb strikes to the head and still remain ambulatory truly became the stuff of legend. It was May 1st, 2000. That evening would see the quarter, semi and finals of the Openweight Grand Prix take place in one event. 8 men were vying for the title of Openweight champion, and again, with this being an era where fighter safety was as pressing a concern as woolly mammoth attacks, in order to make it to the finals, you would have to fight 3 times in one night. Just for reference, the current UFC heavyweight champion John Jones has fought 3 times in the last 5 years. Despite Fujita's legitimate wrestling background, he was good enough that he had only narrowly missed being on the Japanese Olympic team. People seemed to view him as almost a bit of a joke, likely due to his association with pro wrestling. He had spent 4 years as a pro wrestler before entering Pride and was mentored by none other than Antonio Inoki. This relationship led to Fujita having a second nickname, the last disciple of Antonio Inoki. Pro wrestling, especially in the West, was still very much viewed as cartoon play fighting. When people thought of wrestling, this was the kind of shit that sprang to mind. As such, virtually no one picked Fujita to win, and Pride's commentators seemed baffled as to what exactly he could do in order to win this fight, short of calling in a fucking orbital strike.
Mr. Fujita will try and use his strength. I don't know what other options he can use beside that, and that's only a matter of time before you get tired of using strength.
The shadow of Mark Kerr loomed so large over the tournament that it was inconceivable anyone could withstand the kind of beatings he'd been dishing out, let alone some guy who just did pretend fighting for a living. For 2 minutes, Mark Kerr threw every weapon in his arsenal directly at Fujita's face, almost as if the continued existence of this man's head was a personal insult to him. Kerr lands a knee directly to the face of Fujita that could fell a fucking tree. This was 230 pounds of diamond-tipped muscle moving at impossibly fast speeds and whose only intent was to see what the inside of Fujita's head looked like on the outside. Just listening to the impact of this strike is enough to instill such a primal fear of knees into the listener that their children's children will probably learn to walk on their hands.
Oh, good right hand by Mark Kerr. Oh, knee to the head, Mark Kerr.
That knee strike would have ended the life of 99.9% of people, but Fujita is not like mortal men. He shrugged off Kerr's frenetic assault and employed the MMA equivalent of the rope-a-dope, where you let your opponent tire themselves out by allowing them to cannonade you with 230 pounds of what the Germans call Blitzknie in an attempt to turn your head into an impressionist masterpiece. But for every experience point Kerr put into strength, he received a debuff to cardio. As such, after flinging more body parts than the goddess Durga at Fujita, Kerr was exhausted by the 3-minute mark. Fujita took his back and landed ground and pound for the remainder of the fight. While Fujita wasn't exactly known for anything other than his almost comical ability to take a beating, the man weighed 250 pounds, and his ground and pound was about as funny as a Brendan Schaub stand-up special. He landed punch after punch and threw absolutely hellacious knees. Kerr remained turtled for the majority of the fight, and close to the end, Bas Rutten, who was in his corner, can be heard pleading with him to do literally anything.
That was 2, right on the button.
But it was too late. At the end of the 15-minute round, Fujita had done the impossible. He had beaten the Smashing Machine at his own game, was destined for the semi-finals of the Openweight Grand Prix, and was now the 6th man to hold the lineal heavyweight title. Kerr's tenure as the lineal champion had only lasted 4 months and not seen a single successful defense. But the loss to Fujita and crashing out of the biggest event in MMA history to a heavy underdog was the culmination of months of behind-the-scenes problems that had plagued Kerr's personal life and would ultimately signal the beginning of the end for the Smashing Machine's career.
Fuck, but I couldn't believe because these knees were so hard on his fucking head that he fucking hate him. It's strange.
Unbeknownst to all but his inner circle, 3 months prior to his fight with Enson, Kerr had overdosed on morphine. The rigors of a lifetime of wrestling at the highest level, combined with a career in MMA, a sport that pushes a person's body beyond what any body should ever have to endure in the name of entertainment, had all combined to leave Kerr with a crippling addiction to painkillers.
If this doesn't fucking shake you up, man, I don't know what's gonna. And if you don't fucking get some help, you're not gonna see the new year, man. You're not gonna make it.
Kerr narrowly survived the overdose. Once he recovered, he got clean and doubled down on his training for the Fujita fight by rejoining Bas Rutten's team and committing himself fully to training. On the surface, this all looked promising, a textbook bounce back and recovery, but in reality, this was an exercise in futility. Kerr was attempting to navigate sobriety, train for the biggest fight of his career, and also maintain a tempestuous relationship with his girlfriend Dawn, who at the time was an active alcoholic who had re-entered his life after the win over Enson.
What I hear, what Mark told me, that he has to fight, and she comes home drunk and starts kicking the door, holding him out of his fight. You can do that. You know, you have to be relaxed. If you're training and you have a lot of stress at home, so you can't sleep, that's bad. Then you don't want to go fight it.
Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Shortly before the Fujita fight, Kerr left camp early to be with Dawn.
So tomorrow I was thinking I could train for an hour or something, and then I gotta take off and start driving.
Rutten wanted Kerr to stay and complete the fight preparation, and the pained look on his face as Mark explains why he is leaving is that of a man who desperately wants to shake some sense into his friend, but is also resigned to letting a grown man commit his own mistakes. Kerr's relationship with Dawn reached breaking point shortly before the Fujita fight.
And it escalated to a huge fight. Then from there it just kept escalating, and then she wouldn't leave the house. 3 hours later, The only way I got out of the house was to call the police. You know, the only way. I mean, in the process, she grabs my, thank God they weren't loaded. She grabbed my handguns under the nightstand and, then grabs a razor and starts gouging into her arms and stuff.
All of this goes some way towards explaining why the 2000 Grand Prix played out as it did for Mark. It's simply not possible to endure these combined hardships and somehow perform at the peak of your abilities. Combine all of that with Pride removing the weapons that made the Smashing Machine the most feared fighter of his time. In Pride, knees to the head of a grounded opponent were illegal, as were headbutts and elbows. These were the mainstays of Mark's loadout. Without them, his capabilities were severely diminished. The 2000 Grand Prix, for all its spectacle, for all its importance, was the beginning of the end. Kerr never quite recovered. He would only manage 3 wins in his next 13 fights, before retiring in 2009. Beneath all the muscle, beneath the veneer of the Smashing Machine, Kerr was as fallible, vulnerable, and broken as any of us. Even a Smashing Machine is subject to entropy. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Kazuyuki Fujita was now the lineal heavyweight champion, but the Pride 2000 Grand Prix wasn't over yet. The lineal title and the very real title of Grand Prix champion were still on the line that night in May. Fortunately for Fujita, before his next match, Ken Shamrock made a return to the ring in a non-tournament super fight against Alexander Otsuka, and Guy Mezger also had a non-tournament fight with Masaki Satake. If both fights went the distance, it would give Fujita over a half an hour of recovery before his next fight, where he would face Mark Coleman. Mezger vs Satake went the full 15 minutes. Shamrock v Otsuka lasted 9 minutes 43 seconds. After enduring a creeping barrage of knees so powerful they could turn back a tsunami, Fujita was expected to fight again with only 24 minutes and 43 seconds of rest. Less time than it takes to watch an episode of Dorohedoro. Backstage, the word was out that Fujita was injured and wouldn't be continuing on in the tournament.
He's not coming next round.
I know.
It's just a win call.
Perhaps to save face, or perhaps for an extra paycheck, he made the walk to the ring anyway. As the bell rang, he charged at Coleman. But before he made this final, desperate charge, his corner can be seen preparing to throw in the towel. As soon as Fujita made contact with Coleman, the towel was thrown and the fight was waved off at an official time of 2 seconds in the first round. This is where thoughts on the lineal title diverge. Some people argue with the win over Fujita, Mark Coleman was now the lineal champion. But these people were not baptized in the way of blood, as only the true adherents of the Just Bleed creed know that in order for the title to change hands, there must be an exchange of fists. The lineal title is the record of the man who beat the man, not the man who beat the man on a technicality. Coleman won the fight on a technicality. There was no actual contest between the two men, and the only way a lineal title can change hands without an exchange of fists is if the current holder dies or retires. and both Kazuyuki Fujita and his head were very much active and alive. So with all of this in mind, despite technically losing to Coleman, Fujita very much remained the lineal champion. Flying in the face of logic harder than the goose that hit Fabio, Fujita, the man whose striking ability looked like that of a coma patient being electrocuted and who had less ground game than the planet Jupiter, would go on to be the most successful lineal champion to date, with some caveats. Fujita had 3 successful defenses of the title against Ken Shamrock, Gilbert Yvel, and Yoshihiro Takayama. His first defense of the title would be against the old Ken Slamcock, only 3 months after the 2000 Grand Prix at Pride 10 Return of the Warriors. Pride 10 is mostly remembered today for featuring more doctor stoppages than a McGregor diss track.
They Troy Floyd drones over me home, but I shoot them down with a long range gun. Ask the authorities, I am the law.
First off, fuck your bitch and the clique you claim. West side, when we ride, come equipped. At Pride 10, Kazushi Sakuraba dislocated Henzo Gracie's elbow. Igor Vovchanchin tried to see if it was physically possible to curb stomp someone with your fists when he fought Enson, and Fujita beat Ken Shamrock via cardiac arrest. Kinda. Against Kerr, Fujita had proved the efficacy of allowing yourself to be riddled with high-impact knees until your opponent develops full-body asthma. For the match with Shamrock, he changed tactics and instead allowed himself to be punched in the face for 6 minutes in the hopes that Shamrock would suffer a heart attack and die. And it kinda worked. The best he could do was heart palpitations, but they were still fight-ending.
Unbelievable.
Fujita had legitimately taken a beating so bad, his opponent almost suffered a full-blown heart attack in administering it. But as Shamrock's corner threw in the towel, this was still ruled a TKO victory for Fujita, and his first successful defense of the lineal title. It's arguable as to whether taking a beating so relentless that your opponent almost drops dead really constitutes a win, but as he's the only man to ever score a TKO via suspected heart attack, I think Fujita's earned this one. He went on to win his next 2 fights against Gilbert Yvel and Yoshihiro Takayama. Given the fact that no lineal champion had managed more than a single successful defense up till this point, what Fujita had accomplished was nothing short of a mallet-headed miracle. But weirdness came baked into every Fujita fight, and his next match was no different, as he managed to yet again lose a fight and still somehow emerge as the lineal champion. K1 was a Japanese kickboxing promotion that was home to some of the most iconic names in combat sports in the mid to late 90s. Ernesto Hoost, Jerome LeBanner, Andy Hug, hell, even Bob fucking Sapp had a few fights in K1. In fact, Sapp at one point took over the promotion and tried to turn it into a Thunderdome for steroid-engorged muscle monsters, which honestly sounds fucking incredible, but we'll get to that story another day. There's a very good reason this era was known as the golden age of kickboxing, and it was pretty much all thanks to K1 and its all-star lineup of competitors. By the early 2000s, the golden age had passed, and with the death of one of the biggest stars of that era, the blue-eyed samurai Andy Hug, K1 entered an era most fans regard as its dark age. Nestled somewhere on the cusp of this dark age, in August of 2001, we find none other than old Ironhead himself. The lineal title was about to make a leap from Pride to K1. There are certain sounds that can instinctively spark fear in a person, as if they echoed through countless generations of humanity and left a residual marker on our psyche, something in our sleeping reptilian brain that tells us this sound means death. The pounding of a war drum, or the roar of a wild animal. In K1, It was Wild Boys by Duran Duran. Wild Boys was the walkout music for none other than Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic. And while he would be more famous for his tenure in Pride, Cro Cop started his career in K1. And for his debut fight, he would face Fujita at a 2001 event memorializing Andy Hug. They say that to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Fujita's hammer was a sloppy double leg takedown, and by Christ he was going to use it on every nail he could. Against Cro Cop, he attempted his double leg like he had just bought a subscription to How to Shoot a Blast Double magazine and was determined to get his money's worth. He spammed carefree takedowns, almost as if putting your head on Cro Cop's knee line was some kind of Titanic brain idea. Predictably, the 57th time Fujita changed level for a takedown, Cro Cop kneed him in the face, which opened a cut. K1, for a company that staged fistfights for a living, were real fucking squeamish about blood. So only 39 seconds into round 1, the fight was waved off, and Cro Cop was declared the winner by TKO. It's arguable as to whether or not the lineal title changed hands here. On paper, Cro Cop was the winner via TKO, which suggests quite strongly that the title should pass to him. But the fight was stopped on a technicality, and before the fight was stopped, Fujita had actually completed a successful takedown and was in the dominant position on a pretty green Cro Cop who at that point in his career wasn't all that experienced on the ground. But to quote Linkin Park, in the end, it doesn't really matter, as even if we all agree that Fujita retains the title, he and Cro Cop would rematch at Inoki Bom Ba Ye on December 31st, 2002, and this time, Cro Cop would leave no room for doubt. The lineal title had passed from the UFC to Vale Tudo Japan, to Pride, to K1, and now to Inoki Bom Ba Ye. Fight cards on New Year's Eve had become somewhat of a Japanese tradition, one that's still kept up today thanks to Ryzen, and Inoki Bom Ba Ye was held on New Year's Eve from 2000 to 2003. At Inoki Bom Ba Ye 2002, Cro Cop's unstoppable knees crashed against the immovable object that was Fujita's head for a full 15 minutes. Cro Cop won by unanimous decision, eliminating all doubt surrounding their first match, and became the 7th lineal title holder. Fujita's post-lineal career carried on much the same as his pre-lineal career, in that it's genuinely surprising that by 2024 his head hadn't been worn down like an eraser on a pencil. He lost the lineal title in 2002, and by that point we kinda knew that Fujita's skill level had a ceiling lower than a hobbit hole's. By the time of his second loss to Cro Cop, he was 32 years old. He wasn't going to morph into some elite striker at this point in his career, and he wasn't about to revolutionize the ground game either. He was just a man with a titanium cranium and a love for a good double leg. It wasn't so much that the game had passed him by, more like he was simply content to play his own game, even if it meant occasionally taking blunt force trauma to the head. For most active fighters at this point in their careers, retirement would probably start to look like an attractive option. But Fujita's stubbornness was as durable as his skull. He kept on fighting for another 16 years, bouncing around from Pride to K1, and in recent years Ryzen. Arguably, the peak of his career came in 2003, at Pride 26, when he fought Fedor Emelianenko. It's honestly difficult to convey to modern audiences who may not have been around during Fedor's reign just how dominant this man was. He was on a 27-fight win streak before finally losing to Fabricio Verdum in 2010, and realistically, it should have been a 31-fight win streak, but for a fight early in his career that was stopped due to a cut and was ruled as a TKO loss rather than a no contest. Winning streaks of this length simply do not exist at heavyweight. By the late 2000s, it genuinely seemed like Fedor not only couldn't lose, but couldn't even be hurt. He shrugged off convenience. But before the loss to Verdum, The single moment of Fedor's career where he looked anything less than superhuman was caused by All Iron Head himself. Fedor v Fujita starts as you might expect, with Bas Rutten and Steven Quadros having a few good chuckles about Fujita's atrocious striking.
And that touching the gloves may be the only punch Fujita lands. We'll see.
This fight seemed like such a foregone conclusion that the commentary team probably would have used it as a piss break if they weren't being paid to sit there. But the beautiful thing about combat sports is that certainties do not exist here. As long as someone has possession of their consciousness, they still have a chance. And a couple of minutes in, Fujita was still conscious, and utilised that to achieve the impossible. With one punch, he hurt Fedor harder than he had been at any point in his career. Just listen to the absolute shock of the commentators as they realise what's happening.
Ooh. Oh my God! Fedor's in huge trouble here from an overhand punch by Fujita.
This was the equivalent of Francis Ngannou knocking down Tyson Fury, a moment so unprecedented that despite ultimately losing the fight, it was the only thing anyone could talk about, and made Fujita seem like the real winner. Fujita would go down in history that day as the first man to put a crack in the heretofore uncrackable jaw of Fedor. Fujita's career lumbered on until 2018. He survived merciless beatings at the hands of Vanderlei Silva, and most disturbingly, as part of Japan's ongoing quest to find the world's greatest mismatch, Alistair Overeem. By the time of their fight on New Year's Eve 2009, Overeem had nearly evolved into his final form as the Lord of Steroids. The man was a hulking tower of flesh, an anatomist's wet dream, a bipedal monument to the power of modern-day pharmacology and lax drug testing, and was unbeaten in the last 3 years. Fujita, on the other hand, looked old and out of shape, possibly because he was both of those things, at almost 40 years of age and more overweight than we had ever seen him. This was the worst mismatch since the invention of Hawaiian pizza. Enson vs Vovchanchin was a fight that was genuinely uncomfortable to watch, but Overeem vs Fujita is the kind of fight that makes you wonder if John McCain was right all along. Overeem landed a knee that could split the atom, and Fujita suffered one of the scariest knockouts in the history of the sport. He lay motionless on the canvas for a disturbingly long time, and with each passing moment, it became obvious that this had been no ordinary knockout. He was rushed to hospital, and at this point, even Overeem began to get nervous. He called the hospital to check on Fujita's condition multiple times that night, and later revealed that the knockout had put Fujita into a coma for roughly 6 hours. Thankfully, Fujita survived, and now that it had been proven that he was essentially immortal, he returned to fighting. By 2016, he somehow still had enough mileage left in his head to take beatings by current-era UFC stars like Jiří Procházka. He did manage a win over Bob Sapp, but at this point, I think you can get a win over Bob Sapp as a prize in limited edition cornflakes boxes. But even an iron head can rust, and the KO and TKO losses had begun to accumulate. From 2008 to 2017, he went on an 8-fight losing streak. He did manage to claw back a 3-fight win streak at Road FC, and finally retired in 2018, with an overall record of 32 fights, comprising 18 wins and 14 losses. It's difficult to try and define Fujita's career by any other metric than the sheer amount of damage he took and somehow kept fighting. But that in and of itself is enough to make his career remarkable. He wasn't blessed with any outstanding athletic gifts other than his durability, and his skill set was honestly pretty poor for the time. Yet he leveraged that into a career that saw him compete with the best and shock the world not once, but twice. His career is a testament to the fact that you don't have to be the prettiest, the strongest, the fastest, or smartest. If the one gift that this life has bestowed you is something as seemingly useless as being able to take a beating, then use it, and even that can be turned into something outstanding. Cro Cop's capturing of the lineal title was a significant inflection point for MMA. This was the true ushering in of a new era. The skill level was rising far out of reach for men like Enson or Fujita, men who had become relics of the past. The modern era was howling into existence, and by the end of the decade the lineal title would pass through Strikeforce, Affliction, and eventually back to the UFC. But to reach that point, it would have to be ripped from the hands of the longest reigning lineal champion of all time. The last emperor of Pride, Fedor Emelianenko.
First off, fuck your bitch and the clique you claim. West side, when we ride, come equipped with game.